Hey everyone, welcome to all things litigation finance. My name is Ted Farrell, your host today. We have a terrific guest, Emily Siegel from Bloomberg Law. She is a senior reporter who covers all things about litigation funding. So I thought she would really give us some great perspective. Emily, I know it's surprising because it's a niche podcast, but there is a possibility that there may be a viewer who is not familiar with your work. So just in case, would you tell us who you are, what you do, and then we'll get into it?
Sure. So I work at Bloomberg Law. I cover litigation finance, anything related to litigation finance, consumer litigation finance, mass tort, law firm lending, anything where somebody is funding a suit that isn't a party in the claim, I'm covering it. So and I've been doing that for a little over a year now.
Okay. Now, our crack research team did some research, and I know that you have a master's degree in journalism. Tell me, were there a lot of people concentrating in litigation finance reporting then, or how did you find your way to the litigation finance beat?
So it was kind of winding. I think no, but I didn't even know what litigation finance was probably until I saw the 60 Minutes piece on Burford and all the different litigation funders. But I was an investigative reporter for 5 years at NBC, and Bloomberg Law wanted somebody with an investigative background because this is not a beat that has a lot of public documents, and it's not a subject that has a lot of transparency. Or
you're not going to use the word shadowy, are you? You're not going to use
that
word? You promise?
No,
okay.
I promise. People hate that. Not shadowy, but I mean, just like any financial institution, it's just like anything. Private equity is the same way, but they were like, we want somebody who could talk to people and, is comfortable digging through documents and court dockets and all of that. And it's just, there are lots of things that are actually publicly available. You just need to know where to look. And so that it ended up here, and I use a lot of those skills for this.
Interesting. Okay. So, there's a lot of, stuff. It's a little bit niche, but obviously in the legal press, and there are, podcasts that talk about funding, and there's usually two camps, right? There's the pro funding people who go on and say, this is great. It provides access to justice. Then of course there's, generally business groups who are against it. So one of the reasons I wanted to have you on here is you're probably one of the few people who understands how this business works, but also like you don't really have a stake, right? And so, I'm just sort of like, really interested. So there's these sort of like hotly debated areas, right? Is there going to be regulation? Is this access to justice? I'm just kind of interested at sort of a high level, again, in some of these, like, where do you see those kind of like is somebody winning the war over whether litigation is good, bad, or indifferent? And again, I'm not asking you your opinion, but just, someone who covers that, I'm just kind of interested sort of how you see the state of play today.
It's really interesting because I've been watching, as I was telling you before, like hearings in the Louisiana legislature and Kansas and all of these state legislatures that are having these litigation finance regulatory bills that are up. And some of them are successful, some of them are not. It's just sort of a mixed bag on who really thinks this is important to regulate right now. And it seems to be, I don't think it started this way, but it's becoming much more partisan. It's really almost exclusively Republicans who are pushing for these bills, and that's probably because it's coming from the Chamber of Commerce. So I think that's actually really interesting. When I watch these hearings, the Democratic, legislators are like, why do we care about this? And this is giving access to justice. And so there's that. It's kind of the same debate over and over again. It's hard to say who's winning because there have been some successful bills that have passed, and there have some that have not. I think it's a slow moving process. And I think that those who are pushing for regulation are not looking to get it done immediately. They seem to be aware that this is not going to happen overnight. But I think if they're well resourced, I think they're going to keep pushing for it for a long time.
Right. And that makes sense. And obviously, given the size of some of the entities who participate on the funding level, are certainly well resourced as well. So let me ask you about some of these, because there's a big, a point that litigation funders would make, and I think this is true, but I'm interested in your perspective, that a lot of them will say there's a large distinction. There's sort of three buckets of litigation funding. So one would be, your company has a one-off business-to-business claim. You're going to take a non-recourse loan to pay your lawyers. That's sort of like traditional commercial funding. Then there's sort of more the private credit where, law firms will will borrow money secured by their whole document. But then, and I think this is where a lot of the action is in these regulatory bills, there's this business of you're a personal injury victim, you've been in a car wreck, and you will get some sort of an advanced loan against your proceeds. Is that where you see a lot of this action on the regulation there?
What I think is actually interesting is a lot of people don't really understand these distinctions. And not people in the industry, but the people who are pushing for these bills they just don't really know the difference.
But that's sort of like that's kind of like a feature, not a bug, right?
Yeah.
And
I
right.
And I think that sometimes I've found myself getting confused by the bills because there's a lot of like mixed language being used. And
any person who takes funding, but a person is a person or an associated entity of it, so it's not really person, right? I've seen.
Or they'll say things like these hedge funds are funding, these plaintiffs who get loans against their settlement and they're getting exploited. And I'm like, actually, I don't think that's really what's happening. You're confusing a few different things here.
Right. Well, that's different.
And they confuse so I find it interesting because the bills that I've seen sometimes are just about commercial finance, but some are just about this sort of like plaintiff lending situation that we're talking about. Right. But there's a lot of conflation in the language, and I think there's not always a lot of clarity on what they're talking about.
Yeah, and I think if you look at a lot of state laws around usury, a lot of states will say, the most you can charge an individual is X, but in a business-to-business transaction, that sort of is what it is. So let me just ask you. So what are these sort of so like you were talking about Louisiana. So what is the regulation they're trying? And again, good, bad, or whatever. But are they trying just for disclosure? Do they want to outlaw funding? Like, what are they looking for? So
last year they had a bill that involved disclosure, and it passed the House and the Senate, and then it was vetoed by the then governor, who was a Democrat. And there is a new governor this year, so there were two bills that were put up, one in the House and one in the Senate, and they're a little different. The one that seems to be moving along more is involving disclosure to the Attorney General of foreign investors. And I believe it is just from countries of concern. So it's very specific.
And that's going to be a huge problem, I think, for opponents of the business, because what they're going to find out is North Korea and Russia and Iran are not the ones involved in this business, and obviously, like, these hedge funds are not taking it, but that sort of is what it is. Look, I will tell you from my practice, for what it's worth, I certainly see a big distinction in entering a transaction with an individual and doing a financing with a business. And of course, like, so many of these states already have all these laws about how much you can charge an individual, how much you can charge a business. But that is interesting. Let me ask you this. Off the record, do you think the business is as no, I don't mean it's off the record, it's gonna be on the podcast, but off the record, do you think participants are as worried about disclosure as publicly they are?
Like, are funders worried about disclosure?
Yeah, so no, like, some funders will tell you, like, honestly, like, if there just had to be something in there that said there is a litigation funder and the funder has no control, at the end of the day, they don't think that's a big deal. But I think obviously, for a defendant in a case, what they really want is they want to see the budget, right? Because, okay, they can spend up to this and then they're out of money, and they want to see the damages workup they did about what they think the damages are worth. So I'm interested in, sort of thoughts of if it was just like, yes, an outside entity has put money in and it's not from a sanctioned country.
Yeah, I think that funders are not, they wouldn't be concerned with disclosure in a strict sense of, hey, yes, I'm funding this case. I think their concern is the snowball is potential discovery, our subpoenas are getting pulled into the litigation. I mean, I think a lot of them, and I've spoken to, have said, if it was this narrow, agreed upon disclosure that included language that said you can't do it, this isn't subject to discovery, I think they'd be probably fine with it. I think their concern is not with disclosure itself, is what disclosure could lead to, is if it could become sort of wide-ranging and more just more involved than they anticipated. I think that's really what it is. I don't think there seems to be a huge issue with saying, yeah, we're funding this case. Like if that ended up having to be the case, a lot of funders are like, fine, but it's just what happens next that they're worried about.
Well, I think in a lot of ways it'd be good for the business because most of the cases they fund win because they're meritorious. I always said to myself, disclosure would be great for business development because, one law firm is dying to get the funding agreement, and then you're kind of laughing because another partner in their firm is calling to try to get funding in another case, but they're saying, am I going to have to disclose this in my litigation? So that's interesting. Okay, so let me ask you this. So how do you, as a reporter, non-lawyers are reading this, right? Non-lawyers are reading you. Like, what do you hear from them? Like, how do you approach, like, teeing this up so it's not just like lawyers and like the 300 people in the funding business? Like, how do you go about that? Because like this is a very esoteric and niche asset class. Like, how do you approach that?
I think that we always have to assume that whoever's reading this doesn't know what litigation finance is. So you'll often see an explanation of it. So that's always going to be in my pieces, unless it's something really incremental and that like only you and your industry care about. But I think what fundamentally people are interested in how money is flowing, especially our readers. And I think that litigation finance is basically turning a human issue into an asset, a conflict, a dispute, an injury into something that you can monetize. And people find that fascinating, whether they agree with it or not. So I think it's just about putting it into simpler terms. I mean, as someone who's a non-lawyer, it's easier for me to do that because I will read this and I'm like, I have to make this into something that I would read. And, and so, and because my editor is actually a former lawyer, he can help me with that too. So it's not like, I'm not just going in there and interpreting these legal documents on my own. And I can have backup to say like, that's the correct way to summarize that.
And that's interesting. I want to pick up on the thread because it's, it's turning a dispute into an asset, which is totally true. But I mean, that's what civil litigation is, right?
Yeah.
Litigation is, beyond the injunctive relief, but like look at, I don't know, any big, where there's all these price fixing cases for chicken and tuna and all that stuff, right? Like they overcharged you, paid too much, and so I think it's interesting that in a lot of ways, a lot of this is just really kind of like pulling forward revenue that you're going to be owed anyway. So let me ask you a different question. You may have heard that insurers now want to participate in funding deals. I'm interested in your impression on that. There's sort of like this divergence of how big this is, how small it is. In like your travels, and again, you're talking to everybody. I mean, does this seem like a major thing for you? I mean, I'm just interested in and not whether it's a right, wrong, good or bad, but I mean, do you see this as the major thing that it is?
I think it's a thing. I think it's a big part. It's becoming part of the industry. I think that they are always the major sponsors on conferences, and I am seeing a lot of funders going to work in insurance.
But when you say they, you mean the insurance brokers, not the carriers.
Yes, the brokers.
Right.
And what I mean is, I think it's too soon to tell how major it is. I think it's important and it's part of it, but I think I wrote a couple of weeks ago about an insured judgment that was overturned, that was reversed, and the insurers lost a lot of money on that. So how that will affect business going forward?
Well, you don't know yet. I mean, have they paid?
Yeah,
they haven't paid.
Yeah, so we don't know, and if people are really talking about, and I'm just saying the general critics who call litigation finance shadowy or opaque or whatever, the insurance is even harder to find information about.
So is there a word like shadowier or opaquer then? Is that what you're going to say? On the spectrum, there's like the shadow, and then we're just going to like go across. We're going to get there. That's good.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost impossible to really know. So unless you know people who could tell you. And because of that, so it's hard to really say. I think we'll keep hearing things. I think it will continue to be part of the industry. I think the people who have moved over to the insurance broker side are doing that because they're excited about something new and different. And it's, financially, it's a good move for a lot of people.
And I will tell you, really good people with really good jobs are leaving for this sort of more entrepreneurial thing. So I agree with you, but here's what I want to ask you, and I'm just interested in your thought on this, because the funders are like, well, we're here and the insurers are there, but at the end of the day, when you think about it, I mean, litigation funding in some ways is a risk transfer business, right? A company has to bring a lawsuit, and they could take a recourse loan from a bank, but if they take the recourse loan and they lose, so it's really, it's a risk transfer, or a litigation funder wants to get insurance on an investment it makes, so they're transferring risk. So I'm interested, if you, because in some ways they should be converging, right? If it's the same risk, right? If it's the risk of loss, if they're both underwriting correctly, it should kind of cost the same, right?
Yeah, I mean, one would think that.
One would think, yeah, I agree.
Yeah, the costs of insurance, the costs of litigation finance, that is stuff that you are more privy to than me. I have small windows. I get people telling me how much things are, but you're right. I mean, I think with what happened with the judgment that was reversed, which Liberty, I think, was the main position in the tower, there could be price adjustments. And I think that's what a lot of people in the insurance industry were telling me. Prices could go up, but that's also something that they were expecting to happen for a while, and they were expecting to see. So I think that could change as well.
Well, I'll say this, and I've been scorned for saying this, but these big losses, no one wants to see them, but it is a reminder that even in a slam dunk case, there is a huge risk. And so when people say, oh, this is expensive, it's well, I have a judgment worth X, and I'm willing to pay you this massive premium to be left holding the bag. So maybe it's not that expensive, right? And if it's too expensive, no one's going to buy it. So, these big losses are this uncertainty. I don't want to really get into the UK, but, this uncertainty that's been created by this PACCAR decision, where there's funders with agreements that are potentially unenforceable, I think, just sort of serves as, these products, which are non-recourse, are expensive. I think we were talking earlier that, you had mentioned there was that piece on 60 Minutes, which was really interesting about litigation finance maybe a year and a half ago. And, I think the reporter said something effectively, an auto loan might only cost you 10% or your mortgage is 7%. But of course, the difference is if you don't pay your mortgage, they get to take your house, right? Mm-hmm. And that's not, that's really not the reality here. Hey, well, look, I want to switch gears a little bit. And again, I don't need you to rank, but what has sort of surprised you from when you started this and what you think about the business now. Like, is there anything that sort of like struck you, like, I thought it would be like this, but it's more like that? I'm just sort of interested, given that you've been on the beat now for, a little while.
I was surprised that I was able to write so much. When I started, a lot of people were like, this is a tough nut to crack. People, there's not a lot of filings, there's not a lot of publicly disclosed things, and people are really private. And, it's very, it is like that for sure. But people have been really helpful and informative in sort of walking me through, what litigation finance is and understanding the industry. The reason I understand the industry is because people like you, and I speak to people, I ask them questions, and it's been really helpful. And on a different note, I think it's interesting how it just spans so many different areas. Like, I did not expect to be sitting in legislative hearings in Louisiana, or going to a hearing in London, or constantly reading through legal documents and also SEC documents and UCC filings. So it's much more broad than I expected it to be, and I get to work, and I get to like play in a lot of different sandboxes with this beat, which is really fun for me.
Yeah. No, go ahead. Keep going.
I was just going to say, I thought I was worried that this would just be me writing up a press release about like XYZ funder closed on their fund, which I do. I write those, and those are interesting. Right. And I love writing pieces about, and I love interviewing people and hearing about the funds and the fundraising aspects, but it's been so much more than that. And I think that's because it's a really interesting subject.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you talk about the people, and this has been my experience and a lot of people. It's a relatively small community in the funding side, and many of the people have a pretty common background in that at one time they were lawyers, most of them in big law firms, which I think is interesting because a lot of the people were never plaintiffs' lawyers, and then they're coming in trying to like handicap it from the plaintiff side. But what I find interesting is like, look, you've written that like certain funders have, closed their doors or been having trouble. And what I can tell you is the people who work there just get on the phone, right? And they call you and you say, these people are looking, you call them. So like, it is a really interesting community. And I think for the most part, the people in our side of the business believe we're on the side of the good, and that we are, providing access to justice, which I think is a big thing. So let me ask you this. So what else big is going on? What's been like a recent article you've written about, or anything, that you think is going to be sort of big over the next, weeks, months, and years? What do you see coming?
I'm really interested, and I've written about this previously, sort of the litigation funding of the mass tort industry. I think that's still really fascinating to me. So that's stuff that I'm curious about, what the next mass torts are that people are interested in. That's been top of mind for me. I'm looking at, Ozempic is one that I've heard a lot about, but I don't know how much funders are interested in these things, PFAS. So those are things I'm interested in. I recently wrote, and this is a continuation of what I'd written previously, of Ethereum, which is a UK funder being subpoenaed in the US for discovery. They funded this Malaysia dispute that has been just really a wild ride to watch. And I think that's going to continue. Basically, they were, these descendants of a sultan in Malaysia sued Malaysia for a breach of contract, and their arbitrator ended up being criminally convicted, and they've tried to enforce the judgment. And I'm curious to see how it plays out. But I mean, it dates back to like historical documents, and it's really interesting. So I'm curious. And the Malaysian oil company was saying they are planning to have some sort of civil litigation with Ethereum in Europe. So we'll see how that ends up playing out. But I'm still following things like that, because
so it's not for the faint of heart, huh? It's not for the faint of heart. Well, it's interesting, when you get involved, look in any in any dispute with a government, right? I mean, that's just is fraught with peril. I mean, and again, I really know nothing. I mean, I've read articles. I know nothing about that underlying case, but that's sort of an interesting one. So
like Burford funding the Argentina dispute, all these like government arbitrations and long-term cases are really, really interesting, and they take such a long time. So, when I was writing up that story, I have all this knowledge about that case, and I'm like, how can I write this succinctly? Because this literally dates back to the 1800s. So I have to like encompass all of that.
Well, I think in law school, there's the ancient documents exception to hearsay. So maybe they were all, maybe they're all included in the arbitration. I don't know. I remember looking at something that went back to mining rights, but they kind of have it all in the bag, and it's pretty interesting. And then, so you were talking about mass tort. So what do you see sort of in the mass tort landscape? I know you said you want to learn more, but I mean, do you get the sense that funders are still full speed ahead, or they're cooling, or what are your thoughts?
I've heard a mix, but I have heard some cooling. And I'm curious how that's going to play out with the lawyers who have a lot of funding. I'm just kind of, I think we're all sort of seeing, talcum powder, Camp Lejeune, 3M, those are sort of on the down. They've been handled. The most claims are filed. I mean, they still need to sort it all out, but what's coming next? I sat in on the Tylenol Daubert hearings. I thought that was super interesting. It didn't pass Daubert. And I think a lot of people, at least people I saw who were there, were kind of wanted to see what would happen, see if this is something worth funding. When funders are, for the most part, conservative, they're not really interested in funding something prior to Daubert. So,
that's the big one. That is interesting. And I will tell you that I hear the same of, is there another mass torter? And frankly, was talcum powder, J&J sold asbestos for 50 years and lied about it. Like, maybe we should be happy that doesn't happen again, right? Or maybe there's not another military base where they're drinking contaminated groundwater, right? In Lejeune, I was thinking about today. I mean, I give the government a lot of credit because governments and large entities generally don't take accountability for anything, right? I mean, that's just that's how all organizations work, right? It's like circle the wagons, lie, obfuscate. They've said, the contaminated groundwater was there, and these injuries to both the servicemen and their families are horrible, and we're going to give you a chance to prove it up and get paid. So the thing about Lejeune that I think gets lost because everyone complains, oh, well, this was so many ads and it was so annoying and it was this and that. And I'm like, well, literally the well was poisoned, for decades. And I'm sorry you got 3 more emails to your Gmail in addition to, the J. Crew flash sale, and, Joseph A. Bank is, 2 for 1, but too bad. So I think that is interesting. And I think that is, when you talk about mass torts, people kind of forget that it's not a class action, right? Like, you have to opt in and make your claim, and you actually have to prove up your case. So how are you to know, right, without this advertising? So I think it's just, some people obviously are against funding because they don't want anyone to make any money in litigation, and that's fine. But if you do, it's just kind of a necessary thing.
Yeah, and the mass tort industry is just in general really interesting. There's just this entire infrastructure created around people who are harmed, right? And that's just, and what does that mean, and how does that help them, and how, I just think it's so interesting. So I'm really fascinated by that industry and covering it more because of where funders come into play in that space.
Well, and they're the most fun, I'll tell you that. So the mass tort lawyers are certainly more fun than anybody else.
They go to Puerto
Rico. Those events are very different, and they're sort of very fun. So So Emily, if somebody wants to read your stuff, find you Twitter, what's the best place to go?
Well, LinkedIn. I think at this point, Twitter is sort of, I don't really use it as much anymore.
Twitter. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter. I just don't find it to be that. I find that everybody in this space is on LinkedIn. So I'm on LinkedIn. I post most of my stories there. We also have a newsletter for the Bloomberg Law business and practice team. So all my stuff will be in there too. And that's all business of law stuff. So if you're interested in litigation funding, you're probably interested in business of law to some extent too. So, yeah, those are the best places.
Okay. All right. Well, we have just gone past the half-hour mark that I promised. So I'm going to thank you, and I'm going to thank everybody for watching. Have a good one.
Thanks.
Bye.